care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock.
Welcome to the Oshow. I'm Laura Babcock. This is Canada's current affairs show with strong opinions. And our guest today is a woman of strong opinion. When she speaks, it makes national headlines, and she's had quite a spate of them, especially in the month of June around foreign interference. Yes. But one of the main reasons why I wanted to speak with Elizabeth May today is not only is she the female leader who's been in a leadership role of a national party the longest in Canada, and in these days of watching the Kamala Harris campaign take off in the United States, I'm feeling a sense of optimism for solutions. When you speak as a woman leader in politics, people pay attention. You have the mantle in this country of being someone who's been there a while, who understands what's going on, who works well with her colleagues, but also can call out things. And so I want to start with the biggest headlines you've made recently, and then I want to get into climate change, because of course we have fires in Jasper and mass evacuations, huge flooding in Toronto this past week. We're seeing the climate crisis every single day now, it seems, and I want to dive into that with you. But let's just talk about foreign interference for a moment, because, you know, there was a great hue and cry in Canada to get the names and to understand if there were any traitors at work in the Canadian Parliament after we heard about that intelligence report. And I have been on the record on the various other shows that I do saying that I, as a former journalist, really want to know what the heck's going on. And I don't think we can wait too long, or democracy is going to suffer. You know, we'll have less people voting because they don't trust the system. And then you, in the middle of that hue and cry, you came out with a press conference, I think around June 11th, where you said, no, you've looked at the report and you didn't share anything that you shouldn't, but you said that you weren't terribly worried. You thought a lot of it was people unwittingly participating, that there were no current MPs that you thought were actively, you know, trying to work for foreign governments at this time. So is there an update on that, Elizabeth? And I want to thank you for your nuance in the conversation, but where are we now?
Well, I'll back up a bit, Laura, and say that thanks only to the fact that David Johnson, who was our former Governor General, and some listeners at the podcast or viewers will recall, it was a very, it was a failed effort. And it really, I remember when Justin Trudeau announced that he was appointing a quote unquote special rapporteur to deal with the accusations of foreign interference. I remember going out into a scrum with the media in the foyer and saying, you know, this dog won't hunt. It doesn't matter how good a guy and how widely respected David Johnson is. A special rapporteur won't cut it. We're going to need a commission of inquiry. And that's because, again, backing up even further, the Globe and Mail had been publishing information, intelligence documentation that was sent to them, and as David Johnson did report, it violated the Official Secrets Act to have this information conveyed to journalists. The newspapers that printed it violate the Official Secrets Act, and they were making accusations of foreign interference and of that some MPs were actually guilty of putting allegiance to other countries above their allegiance to Canada. So at that point, just to back up, David Johnson's first report said that he believed every leader of every federal political party should be given the opportunity to seek top secret security clearance. I think it's important for viewers to know how would your average MP or even your average party leader does not automatically have top secret security clearance. There's no assumption that you have access to top secret documentation. Now, the committee that filed its report is an innovation. I think it's a good innovation, and I have nothing but respect and accolades for this committee. It's got a very cumbersome title, the Committee on National Security and Intelligence, Committee of Parliamentarians. So it's chaired by Liberal MP David McGuinty. Ontario residents will remember his brother, former premier. I said David McGuinty chairs it, but it includes independent senators. It includes current members of parliament from the Conservative Party, the New Democratic Party, the Bloc, the Liberals, and as I mentioned, independent senators. All of the members of that committee had to obtain top secret security clearance. They did something I certainly haven't done. They went through 32,000 pages of intelligence reports to try to give a picture to Canadians of what kind of threat our democracy faces from basically state actors of foreign governments. Now, we also have in the mix, Madam Justice Hogue was tasked with doing a report on foreign interference. So she's doing a judicial inquiry just to keep all the strands clear here, because it's sometimes, it seems like a big ball of twine or yarn, and that everybody's getting into it like a bunch of kittens and getting tangled up. I try to keep my lines clear. So because of David Johnson, I was able to seek top secret security clearance, and I did so starting in June of 2023. It's a long process. I filed a lot of documentation. I had some preliminary interviews. Parliament rose for the summer at the end of June 2023. I went back to my riding in British Columbia. And on June 29th, this is neither here nor there, but I had a stroke. So that meant in recovering from a hemorrhagic stroke that the doctors said that for a while, at least, I shouldn't be flying in an airplane. What was on my mind the most was I've got to get back to Ottawa because I've got one more interview to get my top secret security clearance, and it has to be done in person. So sorry, Laura, I know I should have made this long story shorter, but I took the train across Canada in August for the purpose of getting my top secret security clearance. And I'm so glad I did it. Got it done in August of 2023, so that when all of this was blowing up and the report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians came out, like the publicly available report has a lot of information that's important for Canadians to know. It's not like they didn't disclose a great deal, but they did, through their report, they had redacted the information that was considered top secret and should not be shared. So the redacting of information meant that there was every now and then, and I encourage listeners and viewers to find the report and read it. The publicly available version makes it very clear we've got a lot to worry about. And I'm not saying, having read the full unredacted report, nothing to see here, folks. But the problem is when the report came out on the publicly available version of the House of Commons committee, Senate committee, not all parties, because Greens didn't have a seat there, but the larger parties all had MPs in that process, and the Senate groups had independent senators in that process. What started happening, and I'm sure listeners and viewers will recall, was speculation was running rampant because the publicly available version of the report says some parliamentarians have have allowed themselves or have consciously and wittingly, and some of the language that was used does give rise to speculation. What on earth does semi-wittingly mean? Only half your brain is on when you did something stupid. I don't know what semi-wittingly means, but I sure wanted to get to the bottom of it, because what was beginning to happen, and not just in the media, in Parliament, in real time, you're looking around at your colleagues and thinking, wait a minute, did somebody here think the interests of the government of fill in the blank, and the notable countries that interfere in our domestic politics are well known. Those names of countries are out there on people's lips. Did somebody think they owed more to the People's Republic of China than to Canada? Did somebody think they should be worried about what India or Iran or what, right? So there was a heightened degree of, I don't think paranoia is too strong a word. And I thought, okay, look, here I am through the fluke of David Johnson's report. I have cleared top secret security clearance. The leader of the official opposition decided he didn't want it, so he doesn't have it. The leader of the Bloc Québécois doesn't have it. The leader of the New Democratic Party, obviously, he did seek it. Jagmeet Singh has it. The leader of the Liberal Party, our prime minister, has it. maybe I can do something here. And I didn't know what it would be, Laura. I didn't know if I was going to be faced with an awful choice, that there was, in fact, because you can recall how it was going in committees. They were grilling various cabinet ministers and saying, will you disclose the names now? Grilling particularly Dominic LeBlanc, minister responsible for public security. Will you give us those names now? And there then grew an unverified, unverifiable assumption that the unredacted version of the committee report somehow contained the names of currently sitting MPs who were, not to put too fine a point on it, traitors.
Right.
So, you know me, I'm like, I haven't changed since grade one. I'm still the goody two shoes who's going to go tell the kindergarten teacher when some of the children are drinking paint. I did that. And I remember my kindergarten teacher said, oh, Elizabeth, don't be such a goody. I didn't think it could be good for the kindergarten classmates I had at the time to be drinking paint. I didn't know it was non-toxic paint. The kindergarten class wasn't worried about the children drinking paint, but that's the kind of, that's me. So I thought I could do something useful here, maybe. But my dilemma as I went, okay, so I'll stop there and just say, I took on what I thought was a question of duty and responsibility to learn as much as I could about what was in the unredacted full version of what my colleagues in this parliamentary committee had discovered. And figure out what can I share without breaking the law. Right. I never bought the idea that Pierre Poilievre and Blanchet put forward when they were offered the chance to get top secret security clearance way back, I think in May of 2023, when David Johnson's report came out. And they said that both Mr. Blanchet and Mr. Poilievre said, that's just a trick so that we're not allowed to talk about it. And I thought, well, now come on. It's never a trick to say, would you like to learn more? And I, as a former practicing lawyer, understand the Official Secrets Act and figured if I can read something that's under the Official Secrets Act, and actually that's what David Johnson suggested, leaders of other parties can read what he read. And at least then, David Johnson's idea was, we could say we think David Johnson's conclusions were reasonable, or we think David Johnson drank somebody else's Kool-Aid and his conclusions aren't reasonable. You don't reveal anything about what you've read to share your conclusions. That's why I thought top secret security clearance would be useful. I didn't think for a minute it would stop me from sharing, back to the name of the show, opinions. I figured I could share opinion without getting myself into a situation where I could be thrown in jail for breaking the Official Secrets Act. So that's the context. And I should pause for breath, Laura, because I will now go into what I discovered when I went into the room and read the report. Is that okay if I just go straight to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. So people should know this is it's kind of like it's not quite John le Carré, but it is a bit spy novel-like. You have to, with the top secret security clearance, you're then told, all right, I arranged it with the people in the Privy Council office who are the people who deal with security questions. And I said, I want to read the report. Now, so first I started by also writing Dominic LeBlanc and David McGuinty, how do I get access to the report? I was directed to the right people to ask in the Privy Council office. Then I'm directed to show up at a building that isn't Parliament, that's basically kind of a top secret undercover kind of place. You go through a door to an Ottawa government building, but it's and you go through that door, you provide your full information, you leave your passport at the front desk, somebody comes down to meet you, they take you to a room which is windowless, specifically so that nobody from another building across the street could train in a telephoto lens and read anything you're reading. I mean, they're really serious about this being top secret. And you're not allowed to bring in any recording devices. You're not allowed to bring in your cell phone, but you're also not allowed, and you don't bring in any staff, obviously. And you're not allowed to have a pen and paper. So it's an interesting process. I sat down at 5 o'clock on a Monday and started reading. This is back in June. So a Monday in June, I start reading the report I've been given, which is the unredacted full version. I have with me a printout of the public version. Now that was very handy because without a pen, without anything to remember anything, it was, well, other than your brain, you're allowed to bring your brain. I had the public version. And when I was reading the non-redacted secret version, I could go back and forth between paragraphs. So in the public version, it would say things like, this paragraph has had several sentences removed to protect confidentiality, to protect our security sources. So the process was long. I sat down, I read it all the way through once, and then I started again at the beginning and read it through twice. Now, I tell you, I had a fair degree of tension in my own brain because I'm turning every page and reading slowly and carefully. And every time I'm turning a page, what I'm tense and frankly anxious about is the point at which I'll turn a page that says the following currently sitting MPs have proactively reached out to another government to turn over top secret security information. Now, I didn't bring the report with me. Actually, I do. I think I do have it, but I know the public version. I think it was, forgive me, because I think it was page 24. There was a section that I didn't bring with me that mentioned a former MP. People can find this, that a former parliamentarian, a former member of parliament, proactively reached out to another government and handed over to a security agent that former MP knew was working for a different government, and handed to that person information that MP had received that they knew to be confidential. So that was the one example that had really, I remember watching the issue panel one night, and Rosie Barton and Andrew Coyne and Chantal Hebert and, and Althea Raj are all saying, that's a very alarming example. How many MPs might there be who've done something like that? Because it was one example. What I'm able to tell you from now, having gone through the full unredacted report, is it's the only example of any member of parliament proactively reaching out and handing over to another government representative information that MP had only by virtue of them being an MP and it being confidential. I went through in fear, as I said, every time I turned a page, because my fear was, if there are names of my colleagues that are covered by the Official Secrets Act, and I can never reveal their names, but there's a bunch of them listed, what do I do? Because I feel the public needs to know, right? As you said, Laura, people were wondering, are there traitors in Parliament? So I went through the whole thing. As I said, I read it all the way through once. I read it all the way through twice. And then there was someone in the room with me from Privy Council office where I could say, do you think I'm allowed to say this about that? And the next day I wrote up a bunch of draft notes of what I thought I could say without violating the Official Secrets Act. And those were vetted before I said anything. So I know Monsieur Blanchet said I must have violated every act because I spoke for over, I don't know how long that press conference was, but it was long. What I'd seen, what I hadn't seen. And there were some things that it was made very clear to me that if I'd revealed too much about another instance that was in the top secret version, if I said much about it at all, it could help a foreign government get a bead on an intelligence asset that Canada is using in some other country and could get that intelligence asset killed. So I was not playing around here. I was being as careful as I could be. And I was, in every instance, and where it got really tricky for me was I knew what I could say because I had my opening statements pretty carefully vetted by people within the security establishment of Canada. I wanted to accomplish a couple of things. And the main one was, if there isn't a list of names of currently sitting MPs who are traitors, I sure wanted Canadians to know that. So that's why I shared what I shared. Secondly, I obviously didn't want to get myself violating the Official Secrets Act. I didn't want to expose any intelligence asset of our security establishment, or expose us to our Five Eye partners as being an unreliable partner. That's where I particularly feel that we need to track down, as David Johnson said in his report as former special rapporteur, people within CSIS who've been treated as though they are whistleblowers. They've been reported in the media as whistleblowers. I don't think CSIS gets to have whistleblowers. Anybody in our security establishment who shares information with the media undermines our reliability with Five Eyes partners. Nobody in the UK or US or Australian spy service, I mean, let's just call them spies. That's they don't want to know that they've got a partner with spies who keep the Globe and Mail on speed dial. That's not going to enhance our reputation globally. Nor does it help Canadian citizens have confidence in our democracy. So I had two goals, Laura, and I'll stop here. Just every time I talk to the media, I had two goals. One was to not take any partisan shots, no matter what. My goal here is to get Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre, Yves-François Blanchet, Justin Trudeau, me, and all the members of the committee that already have top secret security clearance in a room like the one I was in when I read the report, windowless, no eavesdroppers, with some of the people from CSIS or Privy Council office or RCMP, whatever operatives they want to send. Because we as political leaders and elected people need to share and repair damage to our democracy. And I can say definitely, because it's in the public version of the report, the specific vulnerabilities of Canada that are making other governments think we might be worth the interference effort they make, specifically rest in the internal rules and processes of political parties. We all have different rules to an extent. So, for instance, if you're nominating someone to be the official candidate on behalf of X party, if that's one place that there's a lot of foreign interference is in the nomination process. The other place where there's a lot of foreign interference is in the leadership races. And it came to me when I was reading the report saying, I mean, I'm either cursed or blessed with a good memory. The older I get and the more things go wrong, and I'm the only one who remembers that wasn't supposed to happen. I think it's a curse to have a good memory. But anyway, do you remember when Karl-Heinz Schreiber and that all unwound in the Fifth Estate, that he brought foreign right-wing money from Europe back in 1993 to, in the Ottawa Progressive Conservative Party convention, put foreign money backing Brian Mulroney and against Joe Clark. So we've known about this particular vulnerability for some time, and we haven't done anything about it. So leadership races, I think, and nomination contests, if we could all, set partisanship aside and pull together as elected people with top secret security clearance. Now, at this point, we can't bring in Monsieur Blanchet or Pierre because they don't want to get top secret security clearance. But assuming they would get it, and I think it's good for them to get it, we could really pull together enough to send a signal to foreign governments. You not only are you not tolerated in Canada, we've pulled together as Canadians, and we're not going to let you find a vulnerability here. Go someplace else. We are loyal to Canada. There's no space for you here. So that's my goal. So every time I said anything, I thought, these are my guardrails. One is, don't break the Official Secrets Act. That's pretty important. Two, don't criticize any of my colleagues who are leaders of other parties, because they're not likely to want to come in a room and meet together and show that we are united if I've taken cheap shots at them. So that's my That's what I've been working with since I read the report back in June.
Well, I think that's why everyone listened to you, because your kindergarten teacher might have called you a goody goody, but I think it means you're conscientious, right? And so when you came out and you said, listen, some of them might be stupid, they don't know what they're doing these conversations, you know, you were frank, but also you kind of allayed the fears of many Canadians that there's no one actively undermining our democracy right in front of our faces that we're not dealing with, which is where, as a former journalist, for me, it was making me nuts, because I thought the special rapporteur was just a stall. I didn't think it was going to be what we needed. And then to have that come out and think, well, wait, do we get to know if there's an active threat or not? You know, it seemed unbearable. So when you came out and said that, and then of course Jagmeet had his after and said he had a different take on what he read. But what I'm in agreement with you, and I don't want you to, speak of your, partisan way about this, but I'm in agreement. I don't think that it washes, that as a leader of a party, you don't get security clearance to do what you did. I think you said it best, Elizabeth, when you said it was a duty. You felt it was a duty. It obviously took you a lot of effort to do it, a lot of anxiety to do it well, but it helped the national conversation. And furthermore, when you talk about, I love the idea. I don't want to call you Pollyannic. You've been in this business a long time, but the idea of getting all five of you into a room where you all decide that you're going to put up a defense against foreign interference for the sake of Canada and our democracy sounds like a beautiful thing to me. I just, in the current climate, can't see that happening. But, the fact that you're putting it out there as a possible solution, I respect. And that's why I wanted you on the Oshow, because I know that you're working on it.
I wrote them all a letter personally and said, let's do this, let's try. And I do think, one of the places that we never, we didn't talk about it and it didn't get the credit it should have gotten, was we did work together in the beginning of COVID, right? We were not physically able to gather in Parliament and vote because at that point and I'll never forget, it was March 13th of 2020, because it was a Friday the 13th. And I remember standing up with everybody else because it was a unanimous consent motion that we were going to adjourn early and not come back till after the Easter break on April 20th. It is almost ludicrous in hindsight that I remember thinking as I stood there and said, yes, we must not be, as MPs, vectors of this dreadful disease and bring it into our community. So yes, we should not sit again. Greens agree by unanimous consent that we will not meet again till April 20th. And I remember thinking, I wonder if we really need to be gone that long, because what did we know about COVID then, right? So maybe we don't need to take, but I'll go along with it. What was interesting about that period was we had $80 billion worth of federal government spending in emergency response to COVID. It was the CERB, it was the business loan supports, it was the subsidies for salaries so people could keep their staff on. All of those decisions were taken by the same thing I just mentioned, unanimous consent. Because you couldn't, under the Ottawa health rules, even if the Parliament of Canada had decided we're going to reconvene right now, there was no way that the Ottawa health rules would have allowed 338 people to squish together in that room. And under the rules of our Parliament, we had the most antiquated rules for voting of almost any country I can think of. You could only, at the rules as they existed in spring 2020, no member of Parliament could vote unless they were in their own seat and voted from their seat in person. No such thing as remote voting. Even the Parliament of the UK in Westminster, you can't fit everybody in that chamber. There's over 600 MPs. So the way they vote is if you're voting nay, you run down one corridor and a clerk is watching you go by and count your vote. And if you're voting yay, you run down the other corridor. I have a dear friend who used to be a member, Carolyn Lucas was the leader of the Greens in England and Wales. And she used to say, if you want to abstain, you really have to hoof it because you have to run down both corridors. Well, in Canada, you still can't abstain, by the way. So anyway, we went through this period of glorious collaboration and it didn't get any real credit. And nobody really wanted to talk about how great it was. I never felt so proud of being Canadian in my life because we had every other week. Was it every other week or every week? We had a phone call with Bill Morneau and he met with all the finance critics for the other parties. So I would be on a phone call. I think it was every other week, actually, but we met every single day with others. But anyway, we would have this phone call. Minister of Finance, the conservative finance critic in those days was Pierre Poilievre. And the Bloc finance critic was Gabriel Saint-Marie. The NDP finance critic was Peter Julian and me on a conference call by phone. The collaboration was amazing. The goodwill and the spirit of cooperation, putting the country first. There was, I mean, obviously these conference calls weren't public. I mean, maybe that's why people were so nice to each other. They weren't trying to score points for the cameras. But my God, we did a lot of work.
So
And it was shared and collaborative.
Is it possible now? I mean, I would not even ask if it's possible, except for the Kamala Harris advent over the weekend. That's given me hope. I'm trying not to be quite so cynical. I'm thinking it's possible that things can change quickly in politics. Do you think, with the current state of Canadian politics and our discussion, and I want to get to sort of the poly crisis that we're dealing with as a country, do you think that there is that potential for collaboration, or have we gotten ourselves into quite the situation where it's all about political points for the cameras, as you say?
Well, I live for Canadian cooperation amongst us all, because Canadians deserve no less from their elected leaders. So when I look at it, I think, okay, if we could do that during, I mean, 80, imagine this, $80 billion in spending was agreed to by the existing parties that you see in the House of Commons. And it was done by unanimous consent, which means all the negotiations were off camera. And then it would come forward. And if even one MP had made his or her way into the chamber to yell no, that would have been it. It was over. So we had, I do believe that on this, if Canadians, and this is the big if conservative voters and supporters, such that the Conservative Party knows these are our supporters, were to put a lot of pressure on the Conservative Party leader to say, we like this idea. Why don't you get your top secret security clearance, sit down in a room with all the other party leaders and see if you can agree. I mean, nobody can force agreement just because the cameras are off, but I bet we could do it. I mean, I'm friends with Pierre Poilievre. I'm friends with everybody. I can get along with everybody. Then that's not special to me. I think we are, as a small village of parliamentarians, we care about each other. If somebody's sick, somebody's facing a scary health issue, a cancer diagnosis, I can't tell you the kindest emails I got when I had that stroke, not to talk about me, but I mean, I had the most extraordinarily concerned emails and messages from friends in the Conservative Party. We're praying for you. Like, we actually are not bad people. And I tell my friends locally, you know, it was like, oh, this country's losing its way and there's all these terrible people. So there's not one person in that parliament that if I was in trouble on a, you know, in some place where I needed help, car breakdown in a dark place, there's nobody with whom I serve in parliament that I wouldn't call for help and know they'd come to help. So why don't Canadians see that about us? Because we have a really, I have to say, unpleasant vaudeville act called Parliament, in which it's a Punch and Judy show and we hit each other over the head and do a fake ow. It's dumb. Canadians deserve more. But in this context, we're dealing with foreign governments, no question. We better take this seriously. We are dealing, and by the way, Laura, this is one of my takeaways from reading all the reports is, don't forget to look at other orders of government, what's happening in provincial capitals, what's happening municipally. I was shocked to see the extent to which, and this is in the public documentation too, foreign governments attempt to co-opt local community groups, journalists. Like this is a sophisticated effort that's multi-pronged from foreign governments. And what I keep trying to do is say, and by the way, don't forget transnational corporations and their interests on behalf of foreign governments. But never mind, there's a lot of ways in which other foreign interests are trying to interfere with our democracy. I remember the first time, I mean, you've mentioned Kamala Harris. Remember the first time Hillary Clinton was running against Trump, and her people put out that some of the nasty social media stories about her were coming from Putin's people. Now, I'm a big fan of Hillary Clinton. I when I heard that, I thought, well, her people are stretching. That's just not credible. It makes them look stupid to say something like that. But now we know for sure Vladimir Putin was using social media, Russian bots to increase Donald Trump's chances of winning against Hillary Clinton. Every word of Hillary Clinton's, this is the Russians, as crazy as it sounded the first time I heard it, was true. So we as Canadians must not think for 1 second that we have sort of magical powers where foreign governments can't interfere in our democracy. And the best way we can protect our democracy is to stop acting like idiots. And I don't say that unkindly. I say it equally of liberals, conservatives, New Democrats. Saying, what on earth is more important to any of us than love of country? I know every other leader of every other party loves Canada. We are all in the business of public service. But we have too many, I mean, fortunately, the Green Party doesn't have spin doctors, probably because we can't afford them, but we don't have backroom people telling me what to say. That's kind of obvious, isn't it? But anyway, but the other party leaders do. And I don't know a single party leader going back for a long time that I didn't think would be more likable and believable and authentic when talking to Canadians if they didn't listen to their spin doctors. If you're just yourself, your voters are going to know who you are.
Yeah,
in this context.
I think in the Kamala Harris context as well, part of what has been the major thrill of it is that she stopped being a vice president who was told what to say and not to say, and is starting to be herself. And we're starting to see that authenticity. And her laugh is the biggest indicator of it, which is why it's the biggest threat, right? Is that you can't laugh with that kind of joy if you're not in the moment. Right. So that gives me that makes me happy. But Elizabeth, on the point about Canada, you're giving me hope when you talk about all the collaboration that we didn't see and the fact that it really is possible when we're putting the needs of Canada first, and nothing like a crisis to focus the mind, right? But I think it's not just the silly act in the House of Commons, which is supposed to be kind of, common and fun and crazy. It's what happens afterwards. It's using social media. And for those of us who are active on social media, I'm not surprised at all by the bot attacks and the farms, because I get them. Whenever I mention certain politicians in this country, I can guarantee the next 5 hours of my time are going to be just getting attacks, right? So, I mean, there is obviously a populism, an intention to dumb things down and make people buy into simpler concepts of things, which I think lacks nuance and misinforms. And I did an op-ed in the Toronto Star a month or two ago saying Canada is bruised, but we're not broken. Right. We need to watch this narrative from the US, this sense of, all is carnage, therefore all must change. And I think that's rather concerning. So when we talk about polycrisis, because I know you were just doing a speech recently in your area out there in BC, polycrisis, for people who don't understand, it really means that, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, you got to deal with multiple things simultaneously because they all have an intersectionality to them, right? And so when I think of polycrisis in Canada, my list would be the climate crisis. We've got mass evacuations in Jasper, and we've had them out east. We've got a flood in Toronto, which was terrifying this past week. I mean, people were abandoning their vehicles. It's nothing that we've seen before, and you can't just blame it on infrastructure. It's obviously a climate, an unnatural disaster going on. So, I mean, I want to hear from with you on where we should be doing with that. But also, I look at the other polycrisis of protecting our democracy, protecting it both from foreign interference and from the rise of fascism, which is anti-democratic. And I think it's coming up in this country in ways that are fearful to me after watching the US so closely. But also I look at, the housing crisis and homelessness is something I'm very passionate about. Those are, to me, the three big crises, if you will, that we're dealing with. What is it that you see as the poly crisis in this country, as a national leader, that we need to be addressing, and how do we address poly crisis as opposed to sort of individually targeting and solving?
Well, Laura, I'm really grateful for asking me that question. I just want to back up a little bit so I don't appear to have been, incredibly naive. Obviously, as a woman in politics, I get those death threats too, right? I get the nastiness on social media. I very much grieve that Pam Damoff, as a Liberal MP, has decided she won't run again. Women in political life are particularly, and you'll say what you're going to be spending your time on. What I know that's the case. That doesn't discourage me from believing that with a commitment to Canada, we couldn't all get together on this, at least this one issue, to make sure we address those vulnerabilities in our system that create opportunities for foreign actors. So that's one piece where I think we could make progress together, and I remain hopeful we could. But that said, polycrises, I came across the term first through, it used to be at University of Waterloo, now at something called Cascade Institute at Royal Roads, the Canadian academic, brilliant Thomas Homer Dixon. And so I started looking at polycrisis quite a while ago. It's not just Canada, obviously, it's a global phenomenon that we don't have the luxury of sequential crises. I suppose the first time it was when we had the climate crisis, and then we had pandemic. And it was Margaret Atwood was asked by somebody whether, because of COVID-19, the climate crisis was now pushed to the back burner. And she said, well, I don't know about you, but my stove has two front burners. So yeah, we have in that sense, we don't push climate change to the back burner because we have to deal at the same time with COVID-19 and climate. And then we had an acceleration. We have an affordability crisis. We have geopolitical instability, Putin invading Ukraine. That also, by the way, one of the things about polycrisis is the ways in which different crises exacerbate and accelerate other crises in other spheres. So obviously, when Putin invaded Ukraine, it had a real impact on energy prices. It also had an impact on food security. Ukraine's a breadbasket for the world, so prices of grain went through the roof. At the same time that the efforts around climate, the EU had to work really hard to continue to make sure it's going off fossil fuels, wanting to make sure Ukraine still had energy. So, and the polycrisis also, I think we ignore, which is that the threat of nuclear war is growing again, whereas after the SALT treaties and Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the threat of nuclear proliferation of weapons had been receding. It's now accelerating too. So when you look at polycrises, you're looking at a tough challenge, which is to stay calm in the face of multiple threats, each of which connects to the other, and where a solution on one must also have a synergistic positive effect on the others. So when we tend to think simplistically, and the most simplistic thing you could do with any issue is try to get it down to a slogan that rhymes, right? So but if we can think, okay, we have to respond because it's an emergency. The Canadians don't have a roof over their heads. When for me, I remember walking in the Santa Claus parade in Kitchener Centre, where we had a by-election in November in Kitchener Centre, and the Green candidate won, and it was wonderful. But one of the things was my takeaway was the Santa Claus parade in Kitchener Centre took us by a spot that I thought I knew well because it was the train station in Kitchener. I've been there often, but I don't know over what period of time. A really large tent city had sprung up. Now, this is not a place where, unlike Victoria or Vancouver, where tent cities are also not acceptable. No Canadian should be living in a tent for lack of shelter. But Kitchener or Halifax, tent cities in places with severe winters where people can freeze to death, are an entirely different category of emergency. And I'm appalled that we seem to think we can sort of get along with whatever Band-Aid solutions are being offered when Canadians are living in tents in the winter. I go back to thinking about how do we act when it's really an emergency? Because the first public housing ever built in Canada was 1917, 1918, when the Halifax explosion left thousands of people homeless right before winter. They didn't stay unsheltered into the winter. Everybody, the governments, federal, provincial, plus with donations from around the world, which is another factor that won't happen now because governments from all around the world aren't going to be sending money for Canada to build houses. But we have the capacity and we have the wealth to make sure nobody is homeless. So looking at polycrises is a tough thing, but I was very struck when at last year's climate negotiations, and of all horrible places to go for climate negotiation, Dubai, one of the leading voices on climate action and how we can rethink and restructure global finance, because we can't restructure the physics of the atmosphere or the chemistry of the atmosphere. Those are solid. That's science. You can't move that. But we can restructure, as we did in the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of the Second World War. We can restructure the institutions of international financial cooperation. You know, the Bretton Woods institutions. I'm looking all the time at how do we post-pandemic, where every country on earth, it's not this is a unique thing that Justin Trudeau visited upon us. This was the obvious question to ask Canadians. Inflation and affordability crises are hitting pretty much all of our modern democracies. And you're absolutely right, Laura, to point to the risk of galloping fascism is a real risk. So we have to fortify our democracies. We have to defend Ukraine. We have to protect every single Canadian, just as governments around the world have to protect all their citizens. Because otherwise, when people feel insecure and things begin to feel like they're coming apart at the seams, that's when people think, I need the protection of those guys over there, the thugs with the guns. Now, back to Dubai at COP 28, it was the Prime Minister of Barbados. As I said, one of the leading voices on solutions in the world right now is Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. And she was sketching out some ideas for global finance with Sir Nicholas Stern, who used to be the advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the UK government when it was Gordon Brown. I mean, brilliant people. But as a kind of a throwaway line at a press conference, Prime Minister Mia Mottley said, in this poly-crisis world, and then she went on from there. I thought, I haven't heard a Canadian politician talk about this. We are in a poly-crisis world. We have geopolitical instability. We cannot take our mind off for 1 minute the crisis, humanitarian crisis in Gaza, any more than we could take our mind off what do we do to keep the people of Ukraine safe? How do we make sure that every Canadian can afford a roof over their head? All of these things are all at once, but they're all connected. And it takes, I think it takes nerves of steel to be a political leader in a poly-crisis world. But I think Canadians are we're exceptionally well equipped to handle the truth. We have a strong public education system. We generally don't accept dumbed down rubbish as a replacement for solutions that can work. I think we're brave, and we essentially know that we take care of each other and that Canadians are each other's neighbors and we take care of each other. So you mentioned the fires. My husband right now is dealing with one of the fires you didn't mention, the evacuation alert for where he has a farm in the town of Ashcroft, BC. So we have over 300 wildfires burning in BC right now at the same time that BC communities are trying to figure out, like Valemont, BC, right over the border from Alberta, trying to figure out how to help the evacuees from Jasper. Last summer, of course, we had all of Yellowknife, the Northwest Territories, an extraordinary effort. Again, the thing that typifies Canadian evacuation efforts is how successful we are as a country in getting people to safety against incredible odds. And that's because the essence of who we are as Canadians is to take care of each other. So unlike Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in US and New Orleans, did you know that like something like, I can't remember if it was a third or two-thirds of the New Orleans police force left New Orleans in their police cars before the dikes were breached, leaving the poorest of the poor African Americans in sections of New Orleans with no escape routes and flooding. That is never the story of Canada. Fort McMurray with one highway, he used to have one lane north and one lane south. Both lanes went south. The heroism of our first responders, not one first responder in Fort McMurray took off, much less a substantial portion of their police force in their cars. Everybody stayed in place. And if somebody ran out of gas on the highway, pushed their car to the side of the road, and everyone all around them opened the doors of their cars to take in other families. Nobody pulled out a gun and said, go find your own car. We have a superpower as Canadians, and we don't celebrate it and we don't protect it. And to the extent to which rage farming and social media prompted hatreds could undermine our essential strength, which is you can't put a price tag on the value of the things we take for granted, which is that we know as Canadians that if people are evacuated from Jasper and drive into a tiny town, Valemount is tiny. The Legion opened its doors, people opened their homes. We will not leave a Canadian stranded, or for that matter, a foreigner stranded, if we can do anything about it, because that's who we are. And that's why I firmly believe it's never too late to ask our elected leadership to show to the world the best of what makes us Canadians. And it's tied up in all kinds of trite phrases of we can disagree without being disagreeable, or Joe Clark calling us a community of communities back in the day. What we aren't is at each other's throats. And we must insist that our political discourse respect the essence of our values as Canadians, is that we are collaborators and cooperators.
You know, Elizabeth, I love listening to you. I'm almost afraid to listen to you because you're making me feel like it's possible. But I have to say, you know, when I saw today, just before we got on, you know, Poilievre calling Trudeau wackonomics and, you know, and all this stuff. And it's not just Poilievre, but he seems to be doing a lot of it. You know, we have to be better than that. And I actually responded to one of his memes that I thought was wrong. And I said, you know, I think the Overton window has moved since Kamala Harris. It sounds weird, but just since Sunday, we saw an act of great sacrifice turn into a movement of great optimism. And I'm hoping that after what we saw the French people do when 200 French politicians on the second ballot stepped aside, what we saw happen with the British election, what we saw happen in Poland last year with the mass coalitions, what we saw happen in Mexico, I'm hoping that we are at a point where we've kind of seen the fear mongering out of a pandemic. It's maybe been accelerated and exacerbated by social media. And maybe we can cut that cycle short and say, you know what? As I said to Poilievre, the Overton window has moved. People want optimism now. We want hope. You know, I didn't use polycrisis, but I'll use it now. In a polycrisis world, we can't just have everything reduced to things like wackonomics and, you know, and axe attacks or jail not bail. Like, we have to do better. Or I don't want to see what the US has been struggling through happen to Canada. And the way that you describe it, I mean, even after 9/11, remember all the Canadian villages that took in those planes that were landing? There was a Broadway play about it, right? Yeah. So as a country, I think you're tapping into our better angels, if I can rip off Meacham in the U.S. But you know, and I think that I appreciate, Elizabeth, that you are in a leadership role where you are respected and where you don't get into the mud on things. You call things stupid sometimes, and you get out there.
I mean, and by the way, even that description of people being semi-witting or whatever the heck, it's fewer than fewer than a handful of people who may have done something that they should have known better. But the notion of outright betrayal of country, and I should mention one other thing, Laura, I've got a chance. We really do need to beef up what it means to take the oath of office as a member of parliament. We all take the oath that we bear our true allegiance to Canada. That's expressed, of course, because we're a constitutional monarchy, and an oath to King Charles III. Fine, we know that's a symbolic statement. That's Canada. But our code of ethics as MPs doesn't have any follow-up mechanisms for failure to put Canada first. I mean, I actually brought a code of complaint. I brought a complaint against an MP a number of years ago who had taken a job as an expert witness for a U.S. corporation and testified against Canada in a NAFTA tribunal that Canada lost because of the evidence of that sitting member of parliament. And he was paid by the U.S. corporation, and Canada lost $8 million paid to the U.S. corporation because of his testimony. But the ethics commissioner at the time said, well, he was a lawyer before he got elected to parliament, so he's allowed to continue acting like a lawyer. And I kept saying, but what about the oath of office? So I'm just saying that this is a place where I also think we need to fix our internal political party rules, and we have a mechanism in the commissioner of ethics. We have an obligation. I mean, I can tell you the paperwork is persnickety on what shares of what you might own in a property, what your husband might own as a property. Did you get a gift? But it doesn't do anything about something as big as, did you testify against Canada? That to me is kind of a basic no-brainer. If you take an oath that your allegiance is to Canada, you don't help a U.S. corporation get $8 million in damages against Canada. But no. So that needs to be fixed. We need to make sure the oath of office is part of, with tangible measurements that you have to declare. Your oath to Canada covers everything. You don't do a single thing as an elected person within the Parliament of Canada where your top priority is yourself or your career or whatever. Your top priority is always Canada. That shouldn't have to be spelled out. I think most Canadians would think that's kind of obvious. Did you need that spelled out for you? Well, apparently we do.
Well, especially Canadians who want to protect democracy, right? And I don't even like seeing Canadian politicians flirting with anti-democratic forces in any way, because it's just too dangerous. And I wish that people, my hope, Elizabeth, is that anyone who's working in Parliament, leader or member of Parliament or staffer or anybody else, but especially the elected people, realize that flirting with things in the moment, because it might, it might rage farm a bit or gin up some support or get a couple dollars pouring in, can have a really deleterious and existential threat to our democracy. And we need to pay attention to what our neighbors are going through so that we can learn and protect ourselves. So just because the Oshow is about opinion, you've been great at giving them also about solutions. If I can just rhyme off a couple that I've heard since we've been sitting here, when it comes to foreign interference, the party leaders need to create a bulwark, a Canadian wall against it with their own party codes, right? We need to have a better oath of office so that people really understand the commitment to Canada.
An enforceable oath.
An enforceable oath. I love that. We need to make sure that Canadian values are something that are front of mind because of the poly crisis that we're dealing with. We need to have all the best thinking and all of the best collaborative efforts at play, right? We can't just kind of carve off these little things for partisan points. I'm not a partisan, so I find it particularly egregious. But we can't have these partisan points happening for election cycles when it is leaving 200,000 plus Canadians without shelter in a rich country. It's obscene to me, right? Yes. It's obscene. And yes. Fires, it's great that every community is taking in people who are doing these mass evacuations. What happens when that comes down to the population centers? We saw a little taste of that in Toronto when people were abandoning their cars on the lakeshore in the DVP. And I think people are looking at it. So I'm also hearing the solution of restructuring finance to deal with climate mitigation. Since you can't stop the science, you can certainly do something about the financial incentives, right? So there's solutions to all of these poly crises, but it sounds to me like your overarching thesis, if you have one, is that it's going to take adults acting in collaborative capacities, maybe a kind of a new politic to meet the new challenge. Is that a fair exit comment, Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I guess I'd add that we have to look to history for examples of collective courage. There's far too much. Well, I think of Dunkirk and rescuing over 300. I mean, it was an extraordinary effort to rescue the British Army when the Luftwaffe was overhead, and it was little tiny boats of civilians who went over and rescued over 200,000 military men. And in this day and age, we have a threat larger than fascism because we are facing a threat that could end life, well, end civilization, the ultimate. And we never talk about what's the worst case scenario about climate. It's as if there's a binary choice. You either believe there's a climate crisis or you don't. But what we don't talk about is what's the worst case scenario on the climate crisis, and can we still avoid it? Because the worst case scenario is what no one wants to talk about, which is where, because we are continuing, Canada too, continuing to make it worse. And as we accelerate by burning more fossil fuels, by opening up more areas to expansion for producing fossil fuels, by building a pipeline, all those things make it worse. So we have to be able to say that we're committed to our children and our grandchildren, that we have to start making it better. We can't keep pretending that I mean, the liberals are great with doing some few things, but it's a drop in the bucket what the liberals have been prepared to do on the climate crisis. And we're experiencing it, as you say. What happened to Toronto? What a terrifying experience for people. But we had 619 British Columbians die in 4 days from heat in the beginning of July 2021. 619 people. This was the BC Coroner's Office figure. And we're now dealing with, yes, fires, yes, floods. You can list them and rhyme them off. The solutions are there, but the carbon tax is a very small, it's a necessary, but small part of a solution. The really tough things we have to do are tough, and somebody's got to be really brave. And at least people have to be able to say, you know what, to ensure that human civilization continues so that our children and grandchildren have a livable world, we're going to have to actually stop using fossil fuels, not net zero, but actually on a scheduled, planned basis, not tomorrow. But we need to actually readjust what we talk about so that we're talking about what's required. So the kinds of things Mia Motley talks about, just to give you an example, she's, look, right now, by the way, all international air travel and international marine shipping, none of the fossil fuels used in international air travel or marine shipping are under the Paris Agreement. They're kind of out there as if they're not happening.
Well, how did you get to Dubai, though? How did you get to Dubai?
Well, exactly. But the point is, if you don't have an international gathering, you can't get international commitments to do better. And Dubai was the first conference where we named fossil fuels and said we had to work to stop relying on fossil fuels. But when coming back, and Dubai also agreed that by 2030, all the countries there would triple their renewable energy commitments and double energy efficiency. None of that got covered in the papers back home in Canada, that Canada had committed to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency. Those things really matter. But I don't fly anywhere on vacation, obviously. I try to keep my ecological footprint as low as possible. I haven't flown on a vacation for 15 years, and I drive an electric hybrid car. I'm careful as I can be, but it doesn't really matter very much when governments continue to throw billions of dollars to the fossil fuel lobby. So making individual Canadians feel guilty is never going to solve the problem. But we have to this is the thing about polycrisis world, and back to Mia Motley, what she said is, look, put a global carbon tax on every international flight. Put a global tax on the bunker C fuel that's used to move freighters around the world, and put that money in a pot. So the poorest of the poor, countries like Barbados and Fiji and all around the world, countries like Bangladesh, countries that are the African continent, the poorest of the poor, just like in Canada, it's the poorest who've contributed the least to the crises, And in Canada's case, Inuit, Dene, the northern peoples of this country, where permafrost is melting, land is subsiding, and buildings are sliding into the sea, and they don't have highways or infrastructure that can cope with a melting permafrost. Like the shift from take those funds from a carbon price on global shipping and air travel and provide through something like a reimagined Bretton Woods, provide those funds to the poorest of the poor so they are able to secure where they are as much as they can from climate crisis events, and at least make sure that they have virtually free electricity from solar panels. All of this there's solutions out there. They're in the thousands. The solutions are all over the place, but the lobbying power of the fossil fuel industry in every government all around the world. There are some governments that have made enormous strides. Mostly Europe has cut its emissions dramatically from its 1990 levels to 40 to 45% below 1990 levels. Canada is the worst of the G7 countries, and having not done that because we ignored Kyoto when Stephen Harper came in and he said, we're out of Kyoto. Every other country in the G7 has made substantial progress, even after 4 years of Trump, the US has done more on climate than we did. So again, I'm backing up to say there are solutions, but time is not on our side. And that piece that gets missing.
My family and I drove through the fires in BC where we had helicopters dropping water on either side of our vehicle, and we didn't know if we'd be able to get from Merritt down to BC and how to get back out. So they'll never forget that. At the same time, there was a drought through Saskatchewan on that trip we took during the pandemic, right? So these, all the people in Toronto who were freaking out about leaving their cars on the DVP, I was thinking about all the people in tents who lost everything in that flooding through the, I mean, like it's disproportionate to the people who have nothing, this climate crisis, right? And so I love that idea of trying to support people who have nothing, who are going to get hit the worst by it. But let me just end this on a high note then, because polycrisis can get stressful. When it comes to the US, and we talked a little bit about fascism, I see these things all as interconnected, right? When the world seems dire and there's mass migration from climate change, fascism and anger rises and all the rest of it. We've seen this play before. And so what do you think, maybe as an optimistic note for people out there who are still on the Kamala buzz, I think I'm hoping for what I'm calling a Kamala effect, which is that if in fact she is able to win and win large with big money and big money interests and manage to do that with more of an optimistic, and I think she's more environmentally inclined given the Biden record, Biden Harris record, than Trump is, who called it a hoax today. I think that she may, and you tell me, Elizabeth May, do you think that may in fact help Canada, wherever we are with our election cycle, get off of this nonsense around climate denial and all this accident? Like, do you think maybe having to work with a Harris administration might in fact, whoever's leading our government in the next couple of years, incentivize them to be more forward thinking in terms of this?
Yeah. Let me take it to because I'm very tempted to share with you one of my favorite ideas, which is to stop the logging of our old growth forests. Tax the axe.
Yeah, I love that.
Thinking, but it's dumb to have slogans that rhyme. But I do like, scrap the crap. I mean, whatever.
We can all play that game if we want to, but we're trying to solve shit.
But we can think big. And one of the things about polycrisis, as Thomas Homer Dixon, back to the academic brain that where I first started hearing about polycrisis. When things are in polycrisis, you're kind of losing, you're out of equilibrium. And things that are in disequilibrium, if you think of things that are kind of like on a plane that's wobbly, they can shift fast. So like when the USSR collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, they were in disequilibrium for some bit of time before that happened. And the last people to see it coming were the people in the Kremlin. If you think about our current situation of multiple polycrises across multiple different planes, whether geopolitical, climactic, equity, which is a big one, right around the world, which you're talking about all the time here, but the enormous, obscene gap between the billionaire class and almost everybody else, but certainly the poorest of the poor. Think of it as like a Rubik's Cube that's losing form and going wobbly. It's whoa, it's all over the place. In those moments, massive change is possible across all those planes because they are wobbly. They are in disequilibrium. And with proper global leadership and people who are brave, and that will be the people who are in leadership positions, but the people within the citizenry of the world, particularly in democracies, pushing and demanding, we need peace. We need nuclear disarmament. We need stability. We need to avoid the climate crisis becoming unstoppable. We need fairness. We need equity. And all these things can happen fast across multiple planes all at once. Because a polycrisis means nothing is sequential, including the solutions. And that's where hope becomes muscular. Hope becomes an action that one takes in the face of a choice between I could be hopeful or I can decide I'm pretty despairing because why believe anybody anymore? We have, back to duty, a duty to act in the expectation of massive, positive, hopeful change across multiple planes in multiple countries and all at once. And maybe that's the Kamala effect. But I agree with you. I feel very much more optimistic now that we're not looking at sort of the, and by the way, watch out for always Canadians, watch out for a drumbeat of so-and-so's win is inevitable, right? We were hearing Trump's got it, right? Just like we heard and we believed it. I mean, that's why I think voter turnout in Ontario was so low in the last provincial election, 24%. How many months had people been hearing a steady drumbeat of it's a Doug Ford majority, it's a Doug Ford majority, and then only 24% of voters turn out to vote. One of the major messages for hope that we need is for people to realize nothing's inevitable. What changes is when every single citizen decides I can make a difference, and at a minimum, I'm going to vote, preferably decide to do more than that, and collectively insist on better, because Canadians have a right to better.
Well said. My goodness, I could listen to you forever. I think this might be our longest Oshow ever, but I was
I'm so sorry.
No, I was riveted by every moment, Elizabeth, because you know what? Polycrisis is not a quick topic. It is not a 3-word rhyming slogan on how to solve it. So we will eschew the temptation of that, even though it's good in populism. And you sounded at the end very similar to what Kamala said in her first speech, was that every single one of you has a choice you can make about the kind of future we want, and we won't go back, you know, and I think that that's a good message in Canada as well. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you'll come back on again, and I will not only put up, of course, our full unedited conversation, but I will extrapolate little clips so that we can share some of this wisdom from Elizabeth May, the leader, of course, of the Canadian Green Party, but also I think a real treasure in Canada. And I'm glad that you have the memory you have, Elizabeth, because we need to learn from history and be reminded of it. And I'm glad you're there in Parliament with all of your friends, making sure that they're all behaving themselves.
I do love Parliament and I love all my friends, but Canadians, we need to remember how lucky we are. Is there any other country you'd want to live in? And I really loved what you said about bruised, not broken. That needs to be celebrated. We should never fall for people who try to tell us that this country isn't blessed and that we aren't, as Canadians, the luckiest of the lucky. And in this generation, able to do what needs to be done, even if it's hard, and even if it's hard to imagine or visualize, hold on to it, visualize it, see a brighter future, and we'll get there.
I love it. I love it so much. Thank you so much, Elizabeth May. I want my kids to watch this episode. They'll feel better about this.
I hope so. Well, that's one of my old friends. One of my friends, when Bruce Heyer was with me in Parliament, the MP for Thunder Bay, Superior North, he said, you know, Elizabeth, your problem is you've got a drug problem. You're on hopium.
Yeah, right. Well,
Still my problem.
I have to confess, I took a big dose of hopium at 1:46 on Sunday afternoon when I heard that we had a new generation leader, maybe running the United States and de facto the world, right? So I'm excited about that, and to share this with our audience. I look forward to all of the feedback. Thank all of you in Canada and around the world who subscribe to the Oshow wherever you get your great podcasts, or on YouTube. If you want to see all the great facial reactions, just watch us there as well. Elizabeth May, thank you so much. And I can't wait to see the solutions you'll continue to bring forward for our country.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the Oshow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the Oshow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call of the Oshow. It's a podcast, the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. Stay informed with the Oshow.
Your merch bin.